Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. It's been quite a while since I've made one. I've been working on other projects and just been busy and didn't have my cameras handy and so on. Today is Wednesday the 28th of December 2022 and as I say, I'm making a new motorcycle video. In the first part of this video I'm just riding from my house down to Marsden Weir, which is about 2 kilometres away. I strapped the GoPro camera onto the mount on the wing mirror, and this time made sure the card was in, made sure the camera was fully charged, turned on, pressed record, and what you see at the moment is just the road down to Marsden Weir, which as I said is about 2 kilometres away from my house. And I went down there because I was going to go on my morning run, and I wanted to run a particular course, so I rode down there and parked the bike and then set off on my run. And I'm processing the footage for that through my running video. So if you're interested, you can see that when it's uploaded and put the two together. Of course, I never need an excuse to ride the Spyder, but it's about 6 o'clock in the morning at the moment, and the sun's only just coming up. It's been up for about half an hour perhaps. Pretty cool conditions for running, and quite okay for riding as well. So I'm just going past the Goulburn High School now and down towards Wallandilly Public School, and I've got about 21 minutes here to talk to you about various things related to motorcycling, whatever else comes into my mind, because you know that's generally what happens when I'm making these motorcycle videos. I don't always talk about motorcycling things, I just talk about whatever things happen to interest me at the time. And if you're interested, keep the sound turned up. If you just like to see the scenery and not hear me talk, then by all means turn the volume down. Your comments and feedback are always welcome, and I will attempt to attend to all the comments and at least reply to them as soon as I become aware of them. Alright, so I've had this Spyder for a couple of months now, and it's the 2012 Spyder RT, which I think stands for Road Tourer, and LTD. LTD for limited edition. I'm not sure how many were actually made, but the limited edition has all the bells and whistles. It has cruise control, it has the dual clutch semi-automatic transmission, which not all the Spyders did at that stage. Some had the manual transmission with the toe shifter on the left hand side and a clutch, but the LTD had the semi-automatic transmission. It has the electrically adjustable windscreen, it has an audio system through which you can listen to AM, FM or FM radio. If you're in the States, you can listen to the weather service as well. And you can play your music either through a earphone jack plugged into a socket in the back, or what I do is I have one of those Bluetooth transmitters and I have an SD card and I just put that in and play. So it has all the bells and whistles, and like I said, I never need an excuse to ride it, but I don't always ride it as often as probably I would like to, or as I should. So I'm down here at Marsden Weir now, and just getting off the bike and getting ready for my morning run, and then I'm going to come back after I've done the run and jump on the bike again and take a ride around town. I thought what I would do is, rather than describe the ride around town, because if you're a local you'll probably recognise things, and if you're not a local it probably doesn't mean a lot to you, I thought in the first instance at least I would talk to you about a ride I took recently. Now some people say that you need about 4,000 kilometres before you fully know how to ride these things. Now I would probably have done something like 1,500, maybe 1,600, 1,700, perhaps coming up to the 2,000, but I don't yet by any means consider myself an expert or even a person who knows a lot about riding one of these things. What I do know is that all the things that I knew about two-wheel riding I pretty well need to forget. But as I said, I was going to talk to you about a ride I took recently. I recently had reason to go to visit my son who lives in Bacchus Marsh in Western Victoria, sort of about an hour west of Melbourne. And so I took the Spyder, filled up with gas, and set off down the Hume Freeway, Hume Motorway, Highway 31, whatever it's called. Except for various fuel and comfort stops, I just kept going until I got to his house. I discovered a few really obvious, what I thought were obvious things about the Spyder, and some things that I didn't know about it. The most obvious things being that the RT, as I said, stands for Road Tourer, and this is definitely what this bike is for. You can ride it around town, as you'll see me do later in this video, and it'll handle that pretty well. And when you get the hang of how to turn right and turn left and how to negotiate a 270-degree turn on a roundabout without being forced off the back or without leaning yourself at a silly angle or whatever, you'll be comfortable doing that. When you turn left, you realise that turning left is a little bit easy because you don't always make a full 90-degree turn, for one thing, and secondly because we drive on the left side of the road, it just seems to be easier, perhaps to do with the camber of the road. But these bikes are definitely made for open road touring, and by that I mean you get on the bike, you set your cruise control at whatever it is that you want to go at, and it will just go for hours and hours and hours. And the only time that the reason you need to stop is first of all to get fuel or a comfort stop, or because you're getting a bit numb in the backside, which is after about 2 and a bit hours anyway, which is probably a good time to stop. I went on a ride with my son along a trail, the name of which I can't remember, Ryding Trail, I think it's called, or something like that. It's a trail that goes through the high country of Victoria and out along the Werribee River and so on. And parts of the road are paved, sealed, and other parts are not. And in the instruction information about the Spyder, it tells you not to go off-road. Now, it's obviously not an off-road bike, and I discovered that because even with 3 wheels, there were times when it just felt a little bit hairy and a little bit unstable. And I was fortunate that the nanny, as we owners call it, that is the whole suite of safety systems, vehicle stability system, dynamic power steering, and so on and so forth, all kicked in when I took one particular curve in the road too fast. I could feel the bike making corrections for me. But if you know the Hume Freeway or the Hume Motorway, or Highway 31, it's a dual carriageway pretty well from Sydney all the way to Melbourne, and so you can just get on the bike, and since mostly the road is dead straight, there's the occasional uphill or downhill section and the occasional curve to relieve the monotony and keep you awake, but it's pretty well dead straight, so you can just put on your cruise control and the bike will just go and go and go and never miss a beat, and you never have to think that you're working it too hard, or that it's not going to stand up to whatever it is you want it to do. I set my cruise control so that the digital readout on the info screen and the analog speedo was showing me 100 to 101 or 102, maybe up to 105 kilometres. But the GPS system which I have, which comes with the bike and attaches itself to the bike and plays through the audio system, is reading my speed out somewhere between 95 and 100. So split the difference and say I was probably travelling at about 95 kilometres an hour most of the time. I'm not a person who's particularly interested in how fast something can go or how quickly I can get from A to B. I really want to enjoy the ride, and I probably could have gone faster, but I don't want to come under the attention of the gentleman in blue in the highway patrol cars, and I also want to ride within my capabilities. That is my own level of skill and expertise, and the level of skill and expertise of the bike. Now, I don't know this bike as well as I knew my previous one, which I racked up nearly 100,000 kilometres on, so you obviously expect I know it a bit better. So I'm still learning things about this bike. But you know, on an open road, dual carriageway, you're not going to run into a lot of trouble. The only time you're ever going to run into anything that you've probably got to pay too much attention to, or pay any sort of attention to, is when somebody else in front of you decides not to travel at the speed limit, or when you get caught coming up behind a truck and you got to make the decision whether to pull out and go into the second lane and overtake, or just sit behind the truck for a while. Mostly you don't want to sit behind the truck, because even with this machine and even with the screen fully up, you're going to get turbulence from the truck, and you're going to get caught in the slipstream of it, so you want to ride your own race. One thing I discovered is that the octane rating of the fuel that you put in this bike does make a difference. Now, I'm sure it could run on E10 or 91, but it certainly runs best on 95 or 98. And how I know that is when I got the bike and drove it home from Sydney, after about 170 k's of riding, the fuel light was coming on telling me the bike was low on fuel. Now, as it turned out, when I went to fill it up, it had about another 8 litres of fuel, which is close to another 100 kilometres. So the fuel light coming on early isn't necessarily cause for disaster and cause you to think, if I don't find a fuel stop in the next 5 minutes or something, I'm going to run out of fuel, I'm going to be pushing it or walking it. But if you're not familiar with the roads where you're going, then probably once the fuel light comes on, start looking for a fuel stop and fill up, just in case. Now, how I know the difference is that when I filled this bike up and set off, I put 95 octane in it, and I rode for about 220 kilometres before the fuel light started coming on, which was well past Gundagai. So I filled up in Goulburn, and I think I actually got to Tarcutta, which is notionally halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, before the fuel light came on. And so I pulled into Tarcutta and filled up. And again, as it turned out, I put in about 16 and a bit litres for the to fill the tank to the 25 litre mark again. And this time so another time I put in the 98 octane fuel, which is, yes, I know is more expensive, but riding again on the dual carriageway with the cruise control set according to the various speedo readouts at 100 kilometres, the fuel light warning didn't come on till I'd clocked up 260 kilometres. So that was probably 2.5 hours of riding and well and truly time to get off the bike and stretch the legs and so on. But again, it turned out that I'd probably used about 16 or 17 litres, and I still had 8 or so litres in the tank. Now, I did a bit of calculating over the fuel usage going to and from Melbourne, and I found out probably the best I could get out of this bike was about 16 kilometres per litre. And that compares with the Kawasaki Voyager that I had, that when I was riding it to and from work with cruise control on, I could, on a good day, get up to about 20 kilometres per litre or 5 litres per 100 kilometres. And on one trip I got, I think, up 22 or 23 kilometres per litre, and I rode 350 odd kilometres on a full tank. And when I got back to Goulburn after that ride, I think I had about half a litre of fuel left. So the Kawasaki is probably more fuel efficient. It's a lighter bike for one thing, a bigger engine, 1700 with a 6-speed manual gearbox, belt driven, fully laden. It's probably 400 odd kilos. We're fully laden with fuel, and the rider, this thing's probably closer to 500 kilos. It's a 1000cc engine, 5-speed semi-automatic transmission. At one point in about 2013 or 2014, the manufacturers decided to increase the engine size to 1330 and made it a triple, and they also then made it a 6-speed gearbox. And I feel that both of those things would have improved the power and performance. Not that it's by any means lacking in power or performance, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And certainly would have improved the fuel efficiency, because you can definitely feel when you're on the highway that there's just, if there was another gear you could change into and give you a highway overdrive, and the bike would be more fuel efficient. Now, coming to in terms of power and so forth, I don't know, I can't give you the torque ratings and horsepower and all that sort of stuff, because I don't know that information, and generally that doesn't mean a lot to me. But there's plenty of acceleration. If you want to be tearing away at the lights, you can. Obviously you can't lane split with this bike because it's too big to do that. It's almost as wide at the front as a small hatch. You can't lane fill or lane split, but if you want to hair away from the lights, you certainly can, and you can probably go 40 or 50 kilometres in first gear before it's definitely screaming out to say, well, you need to change gear. Whereas with the Kawasaki, the 6-speed, you want to get up into 6th gear fairly quickly. And you don't want to stay down in first gear. You can feel the engine really straining and wanting you to change into a higher gear. So if you're planning a long trip, then be prepared to spend a bit more money on fuel by putting the 95 or the 98 octane rating fuel in the bike, but you'll get the return that you will travel a bit further on your fuel. You will use less fuel for the kilometres that you travel. You will get a better return per litre of fuel, and you won't be stopping you won't be getting that panic about fuel stops. In the case of going from Goulburn to Bacchus Marsh, there are mostly the town, in fact all the towns along the highway now, like Tarcutta and Holbrook and so on, have all been bypassed, so that you don't have to go into any of those towns if you don't need to. There is a service centre at Gundagai, then you can go off at Tarcutta or Holbrook. There is another one beyond there, so I just can't remember the name of it, but there are no service stations on the highway as you come into Albury. Once you've crossed over the Murray, just out of Wodonga, there's a place called Pie Face on the left-hand side, and then a little bit further down out of Albury, a couple of more k's further down out of Albury, there's another place called the Logic Centre, which is a big truck stop. And then the next service centre, because all the towns in Victoria along the highway, like Benalla and Wangaratta, and so on, I can't name the other ones, they've all been bypassed. So there are service centres, but the next one is at Glenrowan. But after that, they're reasonably close together. When I say that, they're probably about 40, 50 k's between them. And they're on both sides of the road, and they're either run by BP or Ampol, and there's fuel, toilets, and there's always food, whether it's McDonald's or Oliver's or one of the, or some other place. But the service stations, they have sandwiches and light pies and soft drinks and coffee and that sort of stuff anyway. So there are plenty of service stops on the road once you cross over into Victoria. The GPS system that I got, which I think is called a Zoomer, made by Garmin, it's made to fit directly onto the headstock of the bike with a special set of connecting pins that plugs into the bike's audio system. And I'm not sure if it's deliberately set that way or the previous owner set it that way, but it appears to be set so that you don't pay any tolls. I took it on a ride to Sydney to my daughter's house, who lives in Cromer on the northern beaches, and following the bike's directions from the GPS, I went some ways that I was not entirely familiar with, but I managed to avoid tolls. But on the way home I was anxious to get home, so I got to I think it's Delhi Road, and it wanted me to continue along Epping Road. I could see the exit to I think it's the M2. I went on there and then went on the M7 so that I could get home. I'd had enough of driving through city traffic. But going down to Melbourne, it turned me off the Hume motorway at Donnybrook Road, if you're familiar with that part of Victoria. And then it took me through a whole lot of small outer Melbourne places, towns, suburbs, I'm not sure exactly what you call them. One of them is called Diggers Rest. I think the other one was called Tulleen. And although the roads were narrow and only single lanes in most ways, and the speed limit was 80 to 100 in most places, there were no toll roads. So and I didn't mind going that way, because although the roads were narrow, after having sat on the dual carriageway for about 6 hours, it's good to be on something a bit different and makes you pay attention and be a bit more alert to the changes in the road, and coming up to towns and villages and so on. I found that the ride from Bacchus Marsh back to the highway took me a very similar route, and I came out at a place called Somerton. Again, if you know Victoria or know that part of out of Melbourne, then you'd be familiar with what I'm talking about. And I took a left turn there, and I was on the highway heading towards Albury. Getting out of Victoria was the longest part of the journey. There was a truck rolled over one of the slip roads onto the highway, and a bit further on there were roadworks being done that ended up with the traffic being banked up for a couple of kilometres. But having got past those two slow as a snail crawling speed sections, I was then able to just put on the cruise control and keep going, and made just a couple of fuel stops. Stopped to have lunch at the Submarine Cafe in Holbrook, and stopped again for fuel at the service centre at Yass before making the final leg home to Goulburn. So that's the story of my journey down to Bacchus Marsh. I went down to see the Billy Joel concert at the MCG, and if you were not fortunate enough to see that performance, then I feel sorry for you, because I don't think Billy will be performing in Australia ever again. 73 years of age and still loves his work, but I think it gets harder and harder to do that sort of stuff. And I guess the reason he decided to do it at the MCG was you get one big paycheck. It's 73,000 people to pay for a ticket. You entertain 73,000 people and they go home happy, you go home happy. And you're not as if you're turning out every night for 5 or 6 nights at the entertainment centre or somewhere like that to put on a show. All right, well, thanks everybody for watching. I hope this has been interesting and informative for you. I hope you've enjoyed looking at the Goulburn scenery. There'll be a second part of this coming shortly, so I'll continue to talk about some other motorcycle related issues in that one. Thank you for watching. I hope you've, as I said, enjoyed the scenery and enjoyed the ride, and enjoyed listening to me talking about motorcycling issues. And I'll talk to you again shortly.